Good morning. I'm Darren Walker, and I'm thrilled to be here and be in this magical theater built for Balanchine in this beautiful, amazing city called New York. But what we just saw on that video was a very different world. A world in Africa, a world where women are marginalized, often left behind and left out. When we see videos, images like this, we often ask ourselves, what can be done? It begs the question, what can the United States do to help alleviate these huge challenges in Africa? What can individuals do who often feel hopeless and helpless when presented with images like this? I'm delighted that this morning you'll hear from two of my sheroes, two extraordinary sensations. The first is Robin Wright, an actress of remarkable talent and renown. You know her most recently in her role as the stunning and cunning Claire Underwood from House of Cards. And Robin has been involved with some very important and innovative and courageous social enterprises in the Congo, and we'll go there in a moment. But first, our woman at the United Nations. Her name is Samatha Power, and she an activist, a leader in civil society, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and someone who makes us very proud. But before talking to them, I want to just frame a few data points to set the scene for this conversation. And the first is in the Congo, where we'll talk about situating this conversation as well as in the global landscape. But in the Congo, according to the UN, there have been more than 200,000 rapes since 1998. In fact, 48 rapes occur per hour in the DRC. And the UN has recorded only 187 convictions by military courts for sexual violence between 2011 and 2013. In the area of conflict minerals, the DRC is a vast, and enormously rich country. But it is the armed military groups who earn hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the mineral and extractive industries, with children as young as 6 years old making up an estimated 40% of the mining workforce. Corruption, something you both know a little bit about. 62% of citizens of the DRC say that they have had to pay a bribe in the last 12 months. These are daunting data and make it very, very hard to imagine what can be done. But Robin, you've been very busy in the Congo. You have a global platform. You're known around the world. Why the Congo? What happened that brought you there?
In 2007, I saw a documentary that John Prendergast turned me on to. He is the co-founder of the Enough Project. And yay! And this documentary basically just unfolds for you the plight that women and girls go through due to this conflict in the Congo that has to do with the minerals that come out of this country are in every single gadget that we use every day, your cell phones, your laptops, your toasters, your hair dryers. And I just felt that there was a direct responsibility for us to take action because we're not going to stop being consumers. We just want to clean up the supply trade.
And what did you see So when was your first visit?
That was about 6 years ago.
And what did you see on that occasion?
We visited most all of the civil society groups, the faith-based organizations that help these women post-trauma. And there are a number of them, thank goodness, because there are so many women that have these long-term physical and psychological damages that they can't get back on their feet without our help. And their children need an education, and a lot of these women can't stand for 6 months, a year and a half. So what they can do is learn how to sew. So they're given the opportunity to have a vocational skill and have sustainable life eventually.
Ambassador Power, you are this icon among women and young girls who say, I want to be Samatha Power. How did it happen? What for you turned you into Samatha Power, this humanitarian, this courageous woman who won't take no for an answer and who just seems determined beyond belief to change the world?
For me, I did not have lofty ambitions. I was not what I would have called at the time a human rights person in college. It was very clear who those people were. There's an air of recognition in that. I was not one of them. I admired them. But for me, there was something about the atrocities that occurred in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s. I was just graduating from college, and I opened up the newspaper, and there were images of these emaciated men and women behind barbed wire in color, not in black and white, but in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust. And I just, for whatever reason, it really was one of those moments. It was a jolt to my system, and I went over in a different form, obviously, from Robin, but I went over to the former Yugoslavia, and once you're up close and you actually see what's happening on the ground, you kind of lose your alibis, and I would have had a lot of alibis at that time. But once I sort of saw what was being done and what wasn't being done by the outside world to end the conflict, I was hooked. And that's been the foundational experience in my life, and I still, even in this job now that I'm a bureaucrat, always make a point of trying to get to the field. So whether Ebola or Central African Republic, or we're trying to prevent violence now in Burundi, which could blow, get on an airplane, go, because what you take back into the kind of more sterile chambers of the United Nations or the boardrooms of Washington is just a wholly different experience. And it's the stories of these individuals that you meet.
So it's the stories on the ground. And Robin, you have talked about being part of a movement that is a grassroots movement. How does someone like you be involved in a grassroots movement? And you see this as a movement?
Oh, it's absolutely a movement. And I was thinking, you know, our God-given right it's kind of limiting the things that we have, and a social movement is one of them, and a people's movement. And if we're talking about the comparisons of, you know, apartheid or Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, this is a movement in the same context of, it's a woman's movement for me, is to make enough noise, put enough pressure on our government and our electronics companies and the gold factories to make sure that there is a clean trade, just like blood diamonds took 10 years, doesn't matter how long it's going to take, continue pressuring the people to wake up and put pressure on those companies, and so on and so on. That's a movement to me.
And look, can I give a
Please.
couple examples just to Robin's point? This citizen movement that John and Robin and others are a part of has one very concrete legislative instantiation, which is in the Dodd-Frank bill, which many of you know about in other contexts. There are requirements for companies to be now transparent about their supply chains. So there's an actual certification regime. The citizen movement pressed members of Congress and members of the administration to include in the Dodd-Frank bill these provisions, and now the knock-on effects are that companies have to abide by these provisions. So it gets into the DNA of the corporate world, as well as into the DNA of how the US government thinks about its relationship to the private sector. That's one example. Another example, the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, which is, has committed such horrors over such a long period of time, kidnapping children, sexually abusing children. Now many of these kids have grown up, they've become fighters themselves, they're abusing other children, they've never had childhoods themselves. That movement has been really eviscerated. Joseph Kony is still at large. He will not be at large for long. The hunt is on. But the number of killings, the number of attacks that they're carrying out is way down. The number of defections from this movement is way up. And that's really the product of a citizen movement. The citizen movement gave rise to, again, a bill in Congress, which in turn gave rise to a strategy by President Obama to go after Kony and weaken the LRA. And these are two examples of how it can work hand in glove. I mean, being in the government, you're not supposed to encourage pressure on yourself. Exactly, but...
It sounds like you are.
Well, in part, I mean, you particularly when you create political space also on Capitol Hill, you secure resources that might not otherwise be available in tough budget times. I mean, the allocations we get for the kind of efforts we're making in Congo, including a huge peacekeeping force that the Congress funds year to year, notwithstanding the fact that the conflict goes on, that's because there's a political space created by these constituents who show that it matters to the American people.
So for you, I don't see you as a bureaucrat, I see you as a diplomat. And
Both?
as a diplomat, now, was it a difficult transition? Because you were a part of those citizen movements. You were a part as a journalist of raising awareness of the atrocities happening and human rights violations happening.
Sure.
And now we see you sitting behind that big secretariat thing.
No, I get to sit behind the United States of America.
And it looks very, very serious, and it looks very intimidating. And so to see this fabulous woman sitting there telling people, what's that transition been like for you? And does it give you an advantage that you were an outsider? Because often many people who are in these positions don't have the experience that you or Robin have.
Well, I can't say the transition was seamless. Back in 2009 when I entered the administration for the first time, I would go into the Situation Room, and having spent my whole career trying to get people who were in government to talk to me about what had actually happened in those meetings, suddenly I'm in the meetings. So all that was going off was intruder alert, intruder alert, intruder alert. But it was amazing, and my mother would not be surprised how easy it was to sit at the head of a table and try to, order people about, which is what you do from the NSC. You try to harness the different capabilities of the U.S. government, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the Treasury Department, on some of the sanctions issues, of course, our diplomacy. So that came naturally. This job is a dream, because this job you can use your voice on behalf of people who often don't have voices. So if I, with the president's backing, decide to give a platform to North Korean defectors, they had a platform here at Women in the World, that's fantastic. Giving them a platform at the United Nations Security Council is something they never dreamed of when they were listening under their covers to their shortwave radios. The idea that they could be legitimated like that, when Ebola was raging and the international response was not at all sufficient, we had the first ever emergency health meeting of the UN Security Council back in September. We were president of the Security Council at that time, and we were thinking, how do we just shake people so they realize that this is just the trend line here, the curve is going off the charts. And so we arranged to have a video from Liberia and from a health worker who described having to turn a father away who was carrying his two daughters, and basically they didn't have enough beds because there weren't enough beds. This was a health worker a Liberian who worked at a Doctors Without Borders clinic, and he literally up on the screen in this, again, sometimes stodgy Security Council chamber, he's up on the screen, he said, "People, if you do not act, we will all be wiped out." and he just says this, and the Security Council and the packed gallery or whatever, that you could just hear a pin drop. And I really think just bringing that story and that perspective, the kind of thing that in the old days I used to try to write up and get in the New Yorker or in Time Magazine, hope that some policymaker would read. Now I can try to bring those individuals into changing the calculus of different countries and hope that that will move them to do more.
So,
Which it doesn't always work, but it gives us a fighting chance.
but you're underscoring the power of storytelling. And Robin, so much of what you have been about is telling the stories of the lives affected, the women you meet. Tell us a little bit about what you do with the Enough Project and the stories that you see on the ground that inspire and challenge you.
I mean, it's twofold. You all understand, and we know, and we can wallow maybe too extremely in the devastating nature of these crises. But when I went there, the consensus was from all of these different groups, all the women, was, can you be a voice for us? Can you go back home and be the voice that ours can't be heard? And tell it to somebody who cares. And you're like, okay, yes, I will. And the world feels it's on your shoulders, and what else can I do? But in concert with that, the amount of grace and dignity and fortitude, they have an amazing will to continue living happily. And we will get through this, and we will persevere. And they've been through hell, and it continues on a daily basis. And we can take action so easily. You can go to enoughproject.org and go to the Take Action page and press your button. It's so simple.
Say that again.
Enoughproject.org, Take Action page. I mean, I don't know how else to answer it. It's very basic.
But it is, in fact, interesting because in some ways you're saying when you see those faces, you see resilience. You don't see that they are powerless, but that they are, in fact, incredibly strong and have a strength that allows them to endure and sustain themselves in the face of these horrific. And how do we change the narrative so that people like all of us who are very privileged, who when we imagine being in those circumstances would just seem like there's just no hope. So much of what both of you are about is the business of hope. How do you keep hope? How do you keep it going for yourselves, for your staffs, for the people because you're out pitching all the time. I mean, you're constantly proselytizing people around this issue. Samantha, you've been doing this for years. How do you do that part of it, the hope part, the keeping people from thinking this is just intractable, we need to walk away?
Well, in part because you meet these people and you just think, I'm totally not worthy, to even, what they are going through and, as Robin was saying, and bouncing back from and determined to give their kids better lives, working 4 jobs, having survived sexual violence in the Congo so their daughter can have a better life, or working, as Obi was here yesterday, talking about getting girls into schools, even in the wake of the monstrous attacks by Boko Haram. You don't have the luxury of just saying, I need a nap, the world is hard, and, things aren't going that well. I think the other thing you do is you look at the examples of where actions have made a difference. I think these days with the rise of ISIL and a lot of the dynamics in the world, there's a sense of things being a little bit out of whack. And even with that backdrop, though, yes, the Yazidis, who I gather also were here yesterday speaking about their plight, have suffered horribly. Sexual enslavement, again, of women and girls, executions of men. And yet, because of a U.S. military operation in very much in conjunction, in partnership with Yazidi groups on the ground who came to us in Washington and here in New York, many Yazidis they're off the mountain. They're living in refugee camps or IDP camps that nobody should have to live in. But because of action, more are alive today than would have been alive otherwise. And so it's never the standard that you dreamed of as a kid of, well, I hope more can be alive than would otherwise be alive. But your job is to save who you can or to support who you can, and even using things that I never used before when I was out of government, like Twitter, just to tweet about Nadia Savchenko, this Ukrainian pilot who the Russians kidnapped in Ukraine, absconded with her to Russia. She's now on trial. It's a totally unjust, it's a travesty of justice. Just meeting with her mother and listening to her mother's story and giving lift to that story and using the tools that we have to put pressure again on the Russian government. I mean, what a privilege. So I think I don't sit around and think, how can I find hope today? You just have a job to do. And these people, they're doing their jobs without a lot of, going meta on themselves. And so I think it's our obligation to do the same.
And Robin, you founded something called Femme?
I couldn't get the attention fast enough from the U.S. government and Congress. I said, well, I'm going to make a product line that is for women. So I decided to do a sleepwear line called Pour la Femme, which means for the women in French. And most of the proceeds go to these civil society groups in the Congo to help these women, microfinancing. Like we just got a video from them yesterday, just weeping with joy because they got a pedal singer sewing machine. And they could actually sit down, and they got a little kit that had some fabric and their thread, and they're able to make their traditional wear and go sell it in their local town. And just to start generating that kind of activity and knowingness that they can have that with our couple of dollars, I thought, well, why not? And I've actually gotten more response to the crisis, to how I can take action just from having this product, where you can go buy a pair of pajamas, and every time you buy a pair of my pajamas, know that you're helping a woman in the Congo.
It's so interesting the way these... And so, where can they buy your pajamas?
Well, online.
Do we have an address?
I think it's plfdreams.com.
Great.
plfdreams.com. Yes, that is our website.
Buy pajamas.
Buy pajamas.
So, Ambassador Power, I received, because I follow you, and I love your Twitter feed. It's always interesting. But I remember receiving this Ebola handshake. And I'd love to, if we could see that photograph, if it's possible, and if it's, what is that about?
Well, that's the way that Ebola spreads, as you know, is through bodily fluids, and turns out a handshake, even just a sweaty palm, could have been the vehicle to pass it. And so a huge part of the Ebola response was just changing social norms, changing burial practices, which were very intimate, but meant that people who died of Ebola then were smothered with their adoring family members, and getting people to not hug and embrace their loved ones when they were sending them on to the next world. It was very, very hard to do. So the handshake quickly became a kind of iconic example of what you had to give up. And everywhere you went, it was very hard. I mean, it was amazing, even, just visiting and having read everything and knowing, all of the things we had to do to minimize risk, particularly thinking about my team, who I was traveling with. And I just get off the plane, and I've read everything, and I'm ready to go, and I'm like, hi. I just couldn't. It is really hard to change habits. And so this was a little deeper into the trip where I'd finally gotten my act together. But you take your temperature several times a day, you wash yourself with chlorine, you do the handshake, and then that, with government officials doing that in a very visible way, you then educate community organizers, and young people came forward. As soon as President Obama decided he was going to send troops to Liberia, the level of recruitment, the ability to recruit people to be part of the solution just went way up, because morale had been so low, and there was a sense that America's on their side, and similar things happened in Sierra Leone and Guinea. But the main factor behind the massive drop in the Ebola infections in the region is that people went from going like this to like this in all kinds of areas in their lives, yeah.
Great. So can we switch gears you play an ambassador to the United Nations. You are an ambassador to the United
I play
Big
an ambassador to the
difference.
United Nations
Huge.
What,
too.
Samantha Power, what would you ask of Claire Underwood if you had an opportunity?
I think I would be more effective if I had Claire Underwood's wardrobe. I think I've reflected on this question,
Well, you know, that's funny.
and I think you'd be more effective if you had my husband.
Well, on that note,
You have like the opposite of my
I have
husband.
something for you because this is the Claire Power dress. So I thought that was very apropos. And that's
Oh, wow, 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 wow.
Why don't
That's
you stand
yours.
up and
Wow.
stand up and present it? I love that.
She read my mind. Okay, watch out, Russians. I'm gonna stride into the chamber. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a clip from House of Cards. Let's take a look.
Mrs. Underwood, allow me to get specific. What is your take on UN Resolution 9214, the imposition of sanctions on the Congo for
The illegal mining and smuggling of mineral resources.
Yes, the United States voted against this resolution.
The DRC is already racked with economic hardship, compounded by an unstable government. It ranks 192 out of 194 in GDP per capita. I think we need to encourage foreign investment and develop new forms of economic growth rather than make one of the world's poorest countries even poorer.
So,
John Prendergast actually wrote that dialogue for me.
but did it give you any insight into the life of Samantha Power? Does it give you any insight?
Any sympathy?
Yes, yes, so much sympathy. I mean, I'm pretending to do something. All I'm worried about is, are my Spanx pulled up? You're actually making policy changes, and you have to be this supreme expert with international diplomacy and human relatedness, human dynamic. You got to figure out how to deal with all of those people at the same time. That's a feat. I mean.
Do you think shows like this drive public awareness about global diplomacy and politics? I mean, what do you think when you see this show?
This particular show drives a huge amount of awareness about Washington. It may not enhance trust in our institutions in quite the way that would be in our interest over time. But, I mean, more people know about, I forget in the first season the storyline about as Claire was being ruthless and terrible to someone who was working in South Sudan, right, or in Sudan. And, the way she's managing with the writers to weave in, with respect to John, that's not the normal kind of dialogue one sees, like a World Bank report dialogue. And because people love the drama and they love the relationship between Frank and Claire, they're getting the spoonful of medicine as well. They're getting exposures to causes that otherwise, they'd have to go and seek out. So I have no doubt that there are cascading effects in terms of interests by Washington junkies who care about politics and suddenly find themselves caring about Congo and Sudan and some of the other plot lines that Robin's worked up.
And on that note, we have to wrap, but I think we are more hopeful after hearing from these two extraordinary, amazing, indefatigable women. We are more hopeful for our world because of you. Let's give a round of applause to Samantha Power and Robin Wright.